Thank you. Okay, I think we'll go ahead and start. Hopefully everybody can hear me. I think I've got the microphone working properly. We'll never know. But so today we're going to take a look at blood. This is the third chapter, the third section in Unit 1. And that means we can have a test in lab next week on this. So, and you'll have the option, you know, you can take it, if you like to take it on ground and don't want to have it online, you can take it, come in and take it. You can take it Wednesday, you can take it Thursday, whatever your schedule works like, or you can take it online.
So I do have a question. So like when we come to take the test, are we still going to be having a lab lecture?
No.
Or it's just to come and take the test?
Just come take the test.
Okay. I didn't know how that was working because I know with the lecture, you said that we'll still be covering the material.
Oh yeah, now in lecture, we will, you know, when I set the date for the test, we're going to just keep on going past, you know.
So like we'll come in for that day for the test and then still have class. Like
Right, because I'm going to wrap up, well, endocrine's done. I finished endocrine, so I haven't set the test date yet for that, but I'm moving on into repro. So repro's not on the test, on that test.
Oh, okay, I got what you're saying.
No, we draw the line where we stopped at the unit, like endocrine is a unit.
Okay.
So, okay.
Okay, so as soon as we're done with the lab exam, can we just leave?
Yeah.
Okay, so as
Yeah,
soon as
I want you to.
Like,
Wait, no, I didn't
like
do
the
that.
Last day, we're just coming in, just take tests. And then,
Yeah, exactly.
I just didn't know.
So, because we have so much flexibility in this lab, and quite frankly, we don't have, you know, we'll be done. We're still going to be done early in April in the
Gotcha.
AP2 labs. So,
Okay, awesome.
yes.
Thank you for clarifying.
when is our first lecture exam?
it's going to have to be after the lab exam, because I don't want to give you a test. I don't want you to have a lecture exam and a lab exam in the same week.
I took all the lecture exams in the same day last semester.
Yeah, well, you shouldn't have done that.
But I passed.
I know you
got
did.
beat.
You
I
did.
got
You
beat,
did
so
okay.
I'm mad at myself.
You did fine, but you know I'm going to make it a little easier. Even if I have to force you this time. So
Hey, I work better under pressure, so it's all right.
Killing it.
that's okay. I understand that too, because so do I. So, okay, let's go ahead and get into blood and bring it up here. Okay. Okay, human blood. This is a image of blood cells going through a capillary. Red blood cells are very squishy. Imagine a red water balloon. So they have a lot of give to them. They can change their shape around. They adapt themselves to the shape, the size of most capillaries. In fact, a red cell is usually bigger in diameter and size than the opening they have to go through. So they have to sort of squeeze themselves through when they get in there. And capillaries are where the action is. Capillaries are where they're the tiniest of the blood vessels, and that's where all the gas exchange takes place, all the nutrient exchange takes place. This is where the cells get their food, and oxygen is at the level of the capillary. Every cell in our body is in contact with at least one capillary. Some of them have up to 100 capillaries. And the red cells, which make up the bulk of our blood, are going to fit themselves through those capillaries. It's not going to cause any problems because they're squishy and they can change their shape. And then when they come through at the other end of a capillary into a larger vessel, they'll expand back to their full size. So now blood is thicker than water. I always like to say that because everybody says that. So it is more viscous than water. It is denser. It has the consistency of chocolate syrup, if you will. If you've ever seen the movie Psycho, when Janet Leigh is busy being introduced to the sharp knife of, his name escapes me now. Anyway, in the shower, they couldn't find an artificial blood to splatter on the floor. So they had somebody above her out of camera squirting chocolate syrup into the shower stall. So it would look like blood coming out from all the cuts. Anthony Perkins, Tony Perkins is killing her. Yeah, and so it was actually probably Hershey syrup because it has the same density. So you want to know what blood, the consistency of blood looks like or feels like at least. It's chocolate syrup. Blood has a metallic taste to it because of the presence of the iron. It is very sticky. We can't see through it. It is a suspension. It is slightly alkaline. Normal pH of blood is about 7.4. It ranges between 7.35 and 7.45. And while that doesn't sound like a whole lot, it's a whole lot when it comes to the functions of our cells. We don't like to get outside that very narrow range there. You get above, even inch up above 7.45 and bad things happen. Same if you get below 7.35. When we get into fluid and electrolytes, we'll talk all about the bad things that happen when we get too alkaline or too basic. It's slightly warmer than body temperature because it's picking up heat from all the cells. And so it's transporting that to the surface of our skin so we can radiate that heat away, or it's bringing it to the lungs so we can radiate heat out through our air. The color of the blood depends on the level of oxygen being held by the hemoglobin. Hemoglobin gets bright red when it becomes fully saturated with oxygen. When it loses some oxygen, and doesn't lose very much, it drops down to a darker red. Every red cell, when it goes through the systemic circulation, when it leaves the left side of the heart, will make a complete pass through the body in 20 seconds, and it gives up about 10 to 20% of its available oxygen. And then it returns back to the lungs and gets fully charged up again at 100%. But we never exhaust the oxygen supply in a red cell. We always have plenty there. We only use about 20% every pass through the body. What you're seeing here, these are fully oxygenated red cells. There's no light source inside our bodies, by the way. But these are, you can see they're bright red and they're fully oxygenated. What someone pointed out yesterday, and I never noticed this, is that over here is a great big old clot forming. These are fibers that we find in solution that have condensed, and we have a clot forming. We have these red cells being trapped here. And this is likely the lining of an artery because the size of the vessel, it's a very large opening, but we're getting a clot form over there that we shouldn't have. I never noticed that till yesterday. Someone pointed that to me. So, yeah, I mean, now it makes perfect sense. I see it right away now. I never looked. I was looking at, oh look, they're moving and they're they're red.
You're like, there's no light there.
Yeah, and well, with with my ADD and my short attention span, oh look, they're red. So anyway. Blood makes up about 8% of our body weight. Males have more blood than females do only because of an average body stature. Male body stature on average is greater than female, so therefore there's more blood. But there's a lot of overlap there, 5 to 6 versus 4 to 5, so it doesn't really matter. We have enough blood in all of our bodies to do what we need to do, even though we don't have every vessel filled up all the time. We never have every blood vessel filled up. We're always about a couple of units shy of having a full load there. We are always moving blood around where we need it to do what we have to do with it. But not every vessel is going to be completely filled every time. Okay, so the roles of blood. Well, carrying oxygen and nutrients, picking up waste products, distributing hormones around here. The red cells will carry the oxygen, the nutrients, and the waste products and the hormones will go into solution in the plasma. And they will all move out of the plasma into the cells as necessary. We use it to regulate our body temperature. On a hot day, we will send more blood to our skin to radiate heat. On a cold day, we will restrict the flow to the skin so we can retain more heat. We can monitor our blood pH. If, for example, when you exercise, You burn more glucose. You run up a flight of stairs, even that's considered exercise. You run up a flight of stairs, you're breathing faster at the end of going up a flight of stairs. The reason that's happening is because you burn more glucose to go up the stairs. Glucose, the end result of burning glucose is to release carbon dioxide. Carbon dioxide goes into our plasma and makes carbonic acid, which makes us slightly more acidic. And the medulla oblongata at the base of our brain says, hey, we're more acidic, and says, let's get rid of some CO2 and we breathe faster. We don't breathe faster to get more oxygen because we've got plenty of oxygen. We breathe faster to blow off the CO2. So we get rid of the CO2, our blood pH goes back to where it belongs. That's how we regulate our pH. Fluid volume is regulated by our blood. If we have, remember that everything we eat and everything we drink ends up in our blood. And so if our blood volume gets up too high and our blood pressure goes up, we will do any number of things to lower that. We will urinate and release fluid. We will perspire. Or perhaps we are low. Perhaps our fluid volumes are low, and we will restrict urination and we will restrict sweating so that we can still maintain a normal fluid level in our bodies. And of course, we protect ourselves. If we have a cut, we form a clot. If we have a penetrating injury of a blood vessel, we form a clot to stop the bleeding. And we also have white cells that are infection fighters. If we have an infection, we'll bring in more red cells, and to carry more oxygen, we'll bring in more white cells. To fight infection, we'll bring in more glucose to heal, provide energy for those cells. If you have a cut or a scratch on your skin, like I get from playing with my dogs, it's red. Well, redness is not a sign of infection, it's a sign of increased blood flow. This inflammation is a sign that the area is healing, because that means it's red because there's greater blood flow going in there. Anytime you have a cut or a small cut or a scratch, you're going to see redness there. And it's only when it swells up in the arm that you get a problem. But little cuts and scratches that have this redness, that's because we have more blood flow going there with more oxygen and more white cells to fight any kind of infection, and also to promote healing. One of those great miracles of our bodies is that we don't have to do anything about healing. We heal automatically. Okay. When we transport, we deliver oxygen to almost every cell in our bodies. The only cells that don't get oxygen directly are the cartilage cells, the hyaline cartilage, the cartilage in our knees, like in our meniscus of our knee or in the pads in our vertebrae. They have to get supplied indirectly through diffusion. But all the other cells get their oxygen and nutrients together at the same time, delivered right to them, and waste products are removed. We take the waste products to either the lungs to breathe out, like CO2, or to the kidneys to filter out and excrete in urine. If the kidneys fail to do their job, if the kidneys fail, your patient will be dead in about 48 hours. It doesn't take long for after kidney failure for the waste products to reach toxic levels. We also circulate our hormones. All those endocrine glands releasing hormones, the only way that we get them to the cells is to circulate them through the blood supply. And of course, they only work in the cells that have receptor sites. And I've already mentioned fluid volume and body temperature, and we can regulate our pH not just by breathing rapidly or breathing slowly. We also use what we call buffers. We have bicarbonate ions, sort of like sodium, like baking soda. We don't have baking soda per se. We have bicarbonate, sodium bicarbonate, which will neutralize acids. So we have a very complex buffering system. We'll talk all about that when we get into fluid and electrolytes. Okay. And I've already mentioned all that. So now here is a white cell going after a bacteria. White cells, the lymphocytes are the what we call the T lymphocytes are the only cells that kill things for us. And so the T cells, in this case, are hunting down those little bacteria to get rid of them. We recognize them as foreign, and so they have to be destroyed. And so our white blood cells do that for us. Most of our white blood cells hang out in our lymph nodes because all the lymphatic fluid has to get filtered through the lymph nodes before it gets back into the blood supply. And our T cells, our lymphocytes tend to hang out there. So but there we go, hunting down a pathogen. Might even not be a pathogen, it might just be a foreign bacteria. So, okay. Now, blood is a connective tissue. It meets the definition because it has a matrix. The matrix in connective tissue can be a solid, like in bone, or a gel, like in cartilage, or a liquid, like plasma. We have formed elements, living cells. We have, bless you, we have red cells and we have white cells, and we have platelets in our as our formed elements, and they are suspended in the plasma. The red cells are called the erythrocytes, and they're just a sac of hemoglobin. That's essentially all they are. There is no nucleus, there are no organelles. It is just a big squishy sac of hemoglobin, with millions and millions of hemoglobin molecules contained inside each red blood cell. The white cells, the leukocytes, or as we like to say, white cells, because leukocytes, like, it just gets old saying that. Just say white cells. Red cells and white cells are fine. White cells, there are 5 different types of white cells, and they all do different things. The lymphocytes I mentioned earlier are part of our immune system. They're the T cells and B cells. I'll get into that a little more here, but they are the infection fighters. The T lymphocytes, the T white cells, go out and kill things. They kill bacteria, they destroy viruses, they kill funguses. The B lymphocytes produce the antibodies that we use to fight off infections with. That gives us our immunity to infection. Some of the other white cells, some will fight parasites and some will work as a giant, what we call a macrophage. They'll go out and eat dead cells and get rid of it for us. And then the platelets, the third category, so we got the red cells and the white cells. The platelets are cell fragments. They're incomplete, but what they do for us is the platelets will form a plug. They're the first part, they're the first part of the clotting process. We get an injury, we're bleeding, and the platelets will all congregate to the site of that injury and nowhere else, and they will form a plug, which is a temporary clot until the true clot can form. And the true clot forms on top of the platelets, and then we stop bleeding and we start promoting the healing process at that point. So that's what the platelets do for us. It's a very important role in function in the blood. That's all they do, is to protect us from some sort of penetrating injury. Now, of the 3 types of elements, the only ones that are true cells are the white cells. The red cells don't have a nucleus. The red cells had a nucleus when they were forming, but they kick it out. They have no nucleus, they have no organelles, they don't even bother to reproduce. A red cell will last for about 4 months and then be recycled through the spleen. We take the iron out of it and we use it again. And again, the platelets themselves are nothing but cell fragments. So again, they don't reproduce. Most of our white cells, even though they are true cells, don't reproduce. Most die in a few days. There's a handful that do reproduce and will carry certain memory of pathogens for a lifetime. Our whole ability to have immunity to a disease is based on the production of antibodies. Whenever you get exposed to a foreign bacteria or virus, and our B cells respond to that. The B cells produce billions of what we call proteins called antibodies, which glom onto these foreign substances and either immobilize them so they can't function or target them for destruction by the T cells. And then you get better. You know, if you've ever had a viral infection, for example, you've ever had chickenpox, or if you've ever been vaccinated for chickenpox, one or the other, we're usually one or the other. You have a lifetime immunity to chickenpox, for example, because the chickenpox vaccine stimulates production of antibodies, and the whole rest of your life when you're exposed to the chickenpox virus. Because think about it, you know, if you get a vaccination and you never get sick, did that mean that you were never ever exposed to that virus?
Not necessarily, no.
No, you get a flu shot. Does that mean, and you don't get the flu this year? Does that mean you were never around anybody with the flu?
Probably.
No, of course not. But it means that every time that you were exposed to the flu virus, you had all these antibodies waiting in reserve just and destroy the virus before you were even symptomatic. So you can go to Walmart and laugh at the virus and not catch it, not become symptomatic. Now, I'm not even going to talk about COVID. I don't think anybody really knows why COVID is so unique, but the point is that normal immunity to a virus comes from the production of antibodies. And these antibodies will stay in our blood supply a lifetime. We will retain a few B cells from every pathogen we've ever been exposed to, so that the next time we're exposed to that pathogen, we'll have a massive response instead of a slow response. So anyway, I'll get into that when we get into the immune system. Maybe by that time, COVID will be gone too. Okay, anyway, moving on. Blood cells are made in the bone marrow. Red cells, white cells, and platelets are all made in the same location from the same stem cells in the bone marrow. And we keep making them over and over and over again. Only the white cells have the ability to reproduce, and only a few of those do. Okay. Now, what makes up whole blood? If we take a test tube of blood and spin it down in a centrifuge, we would see three layers. We would see the plasma layer first. It's sort of a pale yellow layer, and that takes up about 55% of the volume. The next layer we'd see would be a very thin white layer called the buffy coat. And the buffy coat is all the white cells. And then underneath that, we have the red cells, which make up about 45% of the volume of the tube. So the amount of white cells that we see is very, very, very small compared to the red cells. It looks something like this. If we were to take it and spin it down, take a sample, spin it down, we would see mostly, we'd see a lot of plasma on top, a very thin layer of white cells and platelets, and a large layer of red cells. But we see normally, what we see in whole blood, which is this, whole blood on the left has the plasma and the white cells and the platelets and the red cells in there. The buffy coat only represents less than 1% of everything in a sample of blood. So we don't really pay, you can see the buffy coat, you can see that right there, the very thin layer, but there isn't much to it. In a sample of blood, for example, if we had 1 gram of whole blood, we would have probably 5 million red cells and 5,000 white cells and about 350,000 platelets. So there's very, very few white cells compared to the red cells. And there's even more platelets than white cells. So we don't really pay much attention to the volume there, because less than 1% doesn't really matter. We know they're there because we can see the layer, but the bulk of whole blood is going to be the plasma and the red cells.
So is there a difference between whole blood and is there other blood, or is it being separated considered not whole blood?
That's a good
Like,
question.
does that make sense?
Yeah, we can
Okay.
take what we can create, what are known as packed red cells, where we can take whole blood and spin off the plasma and then add more red cells to it and add more red cells to it. So a patient that has, for example, that has leukemia or maybe some other type of blood disorder could get a unit of blood, not just a unit, like take a unit out of you and give it to you, or the other way around. It doesn't. You would get a unit of blood that had like 3 times the number of red cells packed in there. So that's why we refer to it as whole blood. We've taken out most of the plasma, taken out the white cells, taken out the platelets. In fact, you can even harvest platelets.
So whole blood is just your red blood cells
Whole blood is what we have is
in
like,
our body? Okay,
yeah, in our body. So if you were bleeding right now,
that's my whole blood.
that's your whole blood. Yeah. Well, we can even harvest the red cells.
Yeah.
I mean, we can harvest the red cells, we can harvest the white cells. We can harvest the platelets. Platelets are very important. Lots of people receive platelet donations, platelet transfusions.
Yeah, I've heard of that. That's why I was kind of curious, like, what was the difference?
Yeah, so you can get a lot out of a bag of blood. Now, once you do get a donation of blood, and you can freeze it and then thaw it out, but the cells will only last for about a month instead of, like what we have in our bodies now that are good for 4 months. So, but they're still usable. Transfused blood is still very usable, but they don't seem to last as long once they've been, processed. Yeah, there we go. That's a good word, processed. I was going to say abused, but that works too. Question? Okay, I just ask away. We're always open. So, okay, plasma. What is plasma? Plasma is salt water. It's about 0.9% sodium chloride. So it's about 90% water with a bunch of proteins thrown in there, as well as salts. Now, the proteins include the albumins, which is a protein albumin is what we see in egg whites. We don't have egg whites in our blood, but we have that same protein. And we use the albumin as solute particles to stabilize the movement of water, because osmosis moves across membranes, by high water to low water. Doesn't matter what the solute particle is, it's going to drive the movement of the water, and we use the albumin for that. Globulins are proteins that we produce when we are generating antibodies. And the globulins can often be transferred from somebody to give a person temporary immunity. Many serums that were developed years ago for various bacterial illnesses are nothing but globulins. For example, the very first disease ever cured was diphtheria. It was a bacterial inflammation of the throat that caused the throat to close up, and people would suffocate. It would particularly target children. The very first treatment for this, and this is back like 1910, so well over 100 years ago, was to infect horses with low levels of the diphtheria bacteria. See, and the bacteria would produce a poison called a diphtheria toxin. And they would infect horses with this, and they would draw off a couple of pints of blood from the horse. The horse could give a lot. And they'd suck off some of the blood, and they would spin it down and remove the plasma. And the plasma contained the globulins, which were borrowed immunity. And so you could inject that plasma into somebody that had diphtheria, and they would get better. They would recover.
You can do that
Yeah.
with like non-human, like
Yeah, that's how they,
blood?
yeah.
Can you do that with any animal?
Well, horses were better because they had more blood and they could get more plasma, and it wouldn't kill the horse to take out a couple pints of blood. And then,
Okay, yeah, but that's so odd.
Yeah.
It's like, there's people that, when you do blood transfusions, they have to have certain types of blood.
oh yeah, yeah.
So
But
just because it's the plasma.
right, but the plasma doesn't have the antibodies that would trigger a reaction. So you could give the plasma. Of course, also at that time, they didn't know about antibodies and antigens, stuff like that. But they knew that the plasma from a horse that was exposed to the bacteria that would destroy the bacteria in the body. So it was borrowed immunity. So, and it worked. And, you know, all of those types of serum, they used to call them serums, and all those serums, all that work went away when antibiotics came along. So for good or for bad. You know, I mean, lots of people have been cured with antibiotics, but now we have the whole problem of antibiotic resistance. But this borrowed immunity, you know, as an injection, it worked wonders, you know.
Don't do that now.
Not so much anymore. I guess the diphtheria, you know, we're vaccinated against diphtheria. So, but if you've ever heard of the Iditarod dog race in Alaska, you ever hear about that?
Actually, yeah.
Okay, that's based on delivery of diphtheria serum from Fairbanks or Anchorage to Nome. It was done by dog sled back 100 and some years ago, you know, and it was a true event. And they run that race every year to commemorate the fact that there was a big diphtheria outbreak in Nome, I guess, or whatever. And they got the serum there in time to save hundreds of kids.
That's
So,
awesome.
so they keep doing it. That's the whole basis of that dog sled race.
I have a question.
Yeah.
Why do some like diseases, like viruses and stuff, attack children rather than adults or vice versa?
Has to do with the immune system. You know, is the immune system, because children don't have a complete immune system in place until they probably start hitting puberty or even later. Because the first year of our lives, we run off of borrowed immunity from our mothers, and then we start developing our own immunity to different things. You think about when we were,
as a child.
yeah,
That's
I mean,
what it is.
when we're kids, we get sick at the drop of the hat. You know, we get sinus infection all the time. As we get older, we have less and less of those because we have more active immunity. Now, sometimes some viruses and some pathogens attack our own immune system in a way. You'll notice that, like with COVID goes after people with some sort of compromised immune system, maybe the ones with the comorbidities. You know, they have heart disease, they have diabetes, they have things like that. Most of your average healthy individual, if they have COVID, it usually doesn't end badly. So the mortality rate for COVID is pretty low. You know, when you're really, you know, despite what they say in the news, you know, the total number of people in the U.S. that died from COVID in the past 2 years is still under 1 million, which is way low compared to the 1918 pandemic, which killed millions in the U.S. and hundreds of millions around the world. So that epidemic attacked healthy individuals. You know, what we see with COVID, we see older people dying from COVID, people with comorbidities. The 1918 epidemic attacked the healthy people and would kill them in a day because their immune system, the COVID, the pandemic, the influenza virus would infect the cells of the respiratory system. Your immune system would respond very quickly and kill off all those infected cells and leave nothing left behind to protect the respiratory system. And then bacteria, which was sort of piggybacking with the virus, would get in there and your patient would die from pneumonia within 12 hours. So, and it was because the healthy individuals were essentially killing themselves by killing off the virus. So COVID's different. And COVID goes after the people at the extreme ends of the age spectrum. It doesn't hit a lot of people in the middle years. It hits the high and low, which is usually what you expect to see in a virus, in a pandemic like that. The one 100 years ago was just bizarre, and it went away the same way this is going to go away. After the whole world got exposed to the 1918 epidemic, then it went away. There was no cure for it. There was no treatment for it. It just went away. And what's this last one? Omicron is probably, and its variants are probably going to be the last wave of this one until we get enough people that have been exposed to it that have natural immunity. Nothing we've done, has done a whole lot for it. I mean, even the vaccines.
I mean, you can still get COVID, you can still spread COVID. So, I mean,
Yeah, so, okay. What else in our blood? Fibrinogen, it is one of the clotting proteins. It is the fibers that are in solution. Because remember, the definition of connective tissue is you have to have living cells in a matrix with fibers. We can't have fibers in our blood, so we have fibers in solution. And it's a two-step process to turn on those fibers. There's a second protein here called prothrombin. Prothrombin gets activated when we have an injury. Prothrombin then turns on another protein in solution called thrombin. Thrombin then turns on fibrinogen, which forms fibrin, which forms the fiber. So it's a multi-step process. Just like a lot of things in our bodies, you have to go through a couple of steps to get the release of, get the fiber to form. And so we have, it's just, you have to get this to happen, to this to happen. Sort of like renin-angiotensin. You have to have renin activate angiotensinogen, which activates angiotensin 1, which activates angiotensin 2, and then you get aldosterone. It's a multi-step process, just like clotting. And of course, we have enzymes and hormones and stuff like that. We have lots of electrolytes. Those are ions, sodium and potassium and chlorine and calcium in solution in our blood. Electrolytes are the ions that can carry charges. We have glucose, we have ammonia-based waste products, and we have our buffers to allow us to neutralize acids and bases in our blood. Now, one of the first things we can do when we evaluate blood is take a sample of blood, and we're going to look at what we call the hematocrit. And that's simply the percentage of whole blood taken up by red cells. And it's about 45%. That's a nice round number. 45% of whole blood is red cells. Now, it varies a little bit between males and females. It has nothing to do with body stature, but everything to do with the presence of hormones. Testosterone stimulates red cell production, but the androgens in males, which is essentially testosterone, stimulates red cell production, but the androgens in females don't. So the adrenal glands don't help. Estrogen doesn't stimulate red cell production. So the hematocrit in a female is slightly less because there's no testosterone. So we don't have red cell production. But we're about 45% red cells in a sample, in any kind of sample of whole blood, more or less. Okay. Now, why is this important? Well, we don't want to see elevated red cells, and we don't want to see low levels of red cells. If some is good, more is not better. And if some is good, less is not better. We want to keep right around our range of 42 to 45%. If we have a low hematocrit value, meaning we have fewer red cells than we're supposed to, let's say you take a sample of a male and the red cell level, the hematocrit's 40%. That's lower than it should be. That's lower than it should be for a female too. What does that mean? It may indicate it may show the symptoms of anemia. Now, anemia is a condition of where we have less oxygen available in the blood caused by less red cells. Anemia is a symptom. It is not a disease. You don't say someone has anemia. I mean, we do. We all say someone has anemia or they're anemic. Well, anemia is only a symptom of a condition. So the hematocrit will tell you if the hematocrit's low, then they're probably experiencing some type of anemia. What's causing the anemia? And that's where we go on the investigative dig to see what's causing it. There's a half a dozen different diseases that can cause anemia as a symptom. None of them good. The other side of it is polycythemia. Polycythemia is a malignancy of bone marrow. It's sort of the counterpart to leukemia, where in leukemia you overproduce white cells. In polycythemia, you overproduce red cells. But the red cells that are produced are immature, can't carry enough oxygen, and crowd out all the other cells. So you end up not making enough white cells. Plus, when you overproduce red cells, you also tend to have a lot of clotting issues too. And so neither one of these, anemia or polycythemia, are good conditions. Now, how do we measure hematocrit? Well, there's a couple ways. Some of these are pretty old school. Technology will allow us to do it a little quicker than this. But what this does is simply, this is known as a microcentrifuge, and you take a very small micro hematocrit capillary tube, very thin capillary tube, and take a sample of blood, put it in the centrifuge and spin it down. You know, you can see how small these tubes are. And they're no bigger than like an ink cartridge in your pen. Spin it down, you'll get the plasma layer, the buffy coat, and the red cell layer, and then you simply measure the percentage of blood of red cells in that tube. And it's very, very simple. Now, and many of the old school approaches, the low-tech approaches still work very well. You would take a tube, place it in this reader, and then you would simply raise the scale. See the white line on there that you'd use that little lever on the left-hand side and push that up and line up the white line with the top of the red area, and then read the scale. And while it is likely very subjective, you're not going to be that far off. I mean, you may read it as 78, you may read it as 76, I could read it as 72, you could read it as 74. They're all elevated, so we have an issue here, and this is an improvement over something like this. I don't even know when that was made, but it was made in USA, so it's got to be old. So, but this one, this was a little more sophisticated because you stuck your tube in on the holder on the left-hand side. There we go. You'd stick your tube in this holder right here, and then you would raise the bar here until we lined up the white line, till we lined up with the top of or wherever the line for the red cells were, and then you could read the scale here. So this was high tech. It still worked, and it doesn't matter whether you're using. You can scan this. The advantage of technology is that it goes faster. You can read it faster. This method, I'm sure this was used up until 20 years ago at least. So, because that's when we started getting these here. We never get the good stuff. So I didn't say that. So, but yeah, but the values, you don't have to be super precise. If you're above 45% in a male, you got an issue. If you're below 42% in a female, you got an issue. It doesn't have to be precise, even though that we can be, but we don't. We're looking at ranges. So, but it worked. It worked very well for people, and it was used. Come on, let's get. Okay, let me get this cleaned up. Come on, there we go. Clear. Now, okay, now, so that's one thing. It's a very quick and simple test. Look at the hematocrit. Is it above 45 or below 42? It tells you right away you got a problem if it's on either side of those numbers. This one is called a sedimentation rate tube. This is something else we can do. Again, this is another non-invasive technique. Sedimentation rates. How fast do red cells drop down through these tubes if they're suspended in plasma? It turns out that the sedimentation rate is based on whether or not an infection is going on in your patient's body. So we call it the erythrocyte sedimentation rate. The plasma may contain high levels of the protein fibrin. Fibrin is what we, it's not coagulated, it's not clotting or anything like that, but we generally produce high levels of this protein fibrin if there's some sort of inflammatory response going on in the body. So, and what will happen is that we can measure how rapidly a red cell will drop to the bottom of one of these tubes. And the speed they drop is going to be whether or not there's a lot of fibrin there. The fibrin shows up if there's an infection or some sort of inflammation. The red cells will start sticking together. Fibrin is a very sticky protein. It's what we form clots with it. It's a very, very sticky protein. It causes red cells to stick together. When they stick together, they go straight to the bottom. And so when they settle out in clusters, we can say, oh, hey, well, sedimentation rate's really high. There's probably an infection going on somewhere. We still don't know where, but now we know something's going on. So with just a little bit of blood, we can take a look and see if the red cell's too high or too low. We can see if there's an infection going on. And they form, when they clump together, they form what's known as a rouleau structure. They stack together because the fibrin acts like an adhesive to pull them together. And it looks like, they say it looks like a stack of coins. If you're stacking up coins to put them in a wrapper and you knock them over, it looks like that. But I think, to me, it looks more like a can of Pringles. When you open up the Pringles and you pour them out, and they go all out together. I mean, look at the ones there at the top. Whatever analogy works for you, but I think that's what they look like. Fibrin shows up everywhere. Fibrin is what Arby's uses to glue their roast beef together. Nothing wrong with it. Fibrin is a glue. It is a biological glue when it's used outside the body. And Arby's will take different cuts of roast beef and glue them together into big pieces so they can run them through their slicing machines. That's why it always looks different in roast beef from anywhere else. Doesn't affect, I know, doesn't affect the meat, but that's how it's a very common practice in the food industry to take small cuts of beef, and make larger cuts out of it, so that restaurants and hotels do it all the time so they don't waste, like they do like a standing rib roast and they have about a pound or two left. They can combine that with other pieces to get another type of roast, and it doesn't affect the flavor or anything else. So, but it's a food glue, if you will. Well, we use it in our bodies in addition to causing clots. We use it to hold our red cells together to tell us, hey, we've got an infection going on. We still don't know where it is, but we now know that if the sedimentation rate is high, there's likely something going on. Now, and that's what they look like. Stacks and stacks of red cells. So another thing we can measure is hemoglobin. Hemoglobin is pretty important to us. If we have a patient that's got a low hematocrit, their hemoglobin may be the problem. So we would have to measure their blood for their hemoglobin level, and we measure that in grams per deciliter. A deciliter is 1/100th of a liter, and so we would measure it in grams of hemoglobin in here, and the levels are variable. We can see 14 to 18 grams in a male, 12 to 16 grams in a female. They overlap pretty well there. And as long as we're in those ranges, we're fine. If your patient is experiencing anemia because their hematocrit is low, but their hemoglobin levels are fine, then there's something else going on. If we don't have enough hemoglobin, we're not going to make red cells. So we don't make red, because red cells are packed full of hemoglobin. And if we don't have enough hemoglobin, we don't make red cells. If we don't have iron, we don't have hemoglobin. Sort of like we don't have iodine, we don't have thyroid hormone. Well, here, if we don't have iron, we won't have hemoglobin. No hemoglobin means no red cells, which means low hematocrit. But if our hemoglobin levels are fine and we still have anemia, something else is going on. So this is just another simple, non-invasive test that one sample of blood can give you all this information. This was a way that this was analyzed not that long ago. This was real subjective though. You would take a drop of blood and put it on a piece of what we call blotting paper. And then this scale that you see on the screen here, all those circles were actually holes in those color bars. And you would take the sample of blood as it dried on the paper and slide it underneath those holes and try to match the color. Yeah, and the ranges are pretty extreme, pretty far apart, because like this, you see on the side, it says suggestive anemia, 70 to 85%, normal, 90 to 100%. Those are extreme ranges. The problem with this was that every one of us would have seen that color of the blood differently. And plus, the longer you were trying to decide, the more that blood was drying on the paper, so the color would change there too. So real subjective evaluation. We've done that here, but we haven't done it for quite a while because it's not that good.
And wouldn't that change? Because isn't it a thing like when blood is exposed to the air, the oxygen changes the color regardless?
Exactly.
So that would change it as well.
Exactly. It has to be read right away. And you have to have a very good eye for this. Now, I would imagine if someone had been doing this every day, day in, day out, all the time, they would probably get quite good at nailing the value. But there's a lot of subjectivity going on this, and I would really hate to
Be that patient.
I'd hate to be the patient to bank my hemoglobin level on an eyeball, if you will. So okay, so there you go. Exactly.
Well, okay, wait, think about it. They're colorblind, then yeah, the shades would still be the same, or roughly.
Now that would work, because the shades would show up.
Easier that
It might be because because after a while all those reds look the same. You're looking at like I mean I would we've played with it in the lab in years past, and after a while you can't tell anymore, because like you say, it changes color. So who knows, maybe the colorblind person has the advantage. So
maybe they only hired colorblind. I'll show this picture to my dad. Just
Yeah.
there you go. See what he says.
You can't
Okay.
see red. No, I'm interested.
Okay. Blood types. We have 90 different blood groups that are available to us, but the big three are the ABO types, and then we have the RH factor thrown in there too.
I said, which is an odd thing.
It is. But what we have here is on the surface of every red cell, we have antigens. Let's see this. There we go. Here's a red cell. Okay. An antigen is, if you remember from AP1, the glycocalyx structure I talked about way back in cells. The glycocalyx structure is a protein with a carbohydrate attached to it. So this is the glycocalyx with protein and carb. That functions as an antigen. Antigens are identifiers. We have antigens in all of our cells that identify us as self. so that our immune system doesn't attack us. Red cells in our bodies have all these antigens have glycocalyx antigens saying, hey, I'm me, don't attack me. They also have antigens that identify them as what type of blood they have. So if you are type A blood, for example, you might have an antigen that looks like this. I don't know, I'm just making it up. We'll just call it type A blood with the A antigen. If you're type B blood, maybe you have an antigen that looks like this. Okay, so everybody, they don't look like that. I'll just, indulge me. Everybody with type A blood has an antigen that looks just like that on their red cell. Everybody with type B blood has an antigen that looks like the other one. Now, we know that we don't attack our own blood. We recognize our blood cells as us, and we don't do anything, we don't attack each other. But the identifier here is based on the presence of this A antigen or this B antigen. Now, let me see if I can make that a little clearer here for us. Now, okay. If you're type A blood, you have an A antigen on the surface of your red cell. That marks you as type A. Anybody know the blood type? Okay. Okay.
How do you even find that out?
I happen to know I'm A positive. Okay. You can be A positive or A negative, B positive, B negative. You can be AB positive or negative, and you can be O positive or O negative. The positive and negative have to do with the Rh factor. So, but identifying us as type A blood, for example, means that the cell has the A antigen on its surface, making it, I'm A blood, I'm an A red cell, I've got the A antigen. Now, the mortal enemy to A blood is B blood. And you carry in your blood, if you're type A, you carry the A antigen on your red cells, but in your plasma, you carry B antibodies that will attack any red cell with a B antigen on it. So your identifier says A antigen. So you're type A blood. You have nothing to worry about from your own immune system. You don't attack yourself, usually. Because autoimmune disorders happen bizarrely. But the B, you carry the B antibody. So if you were ever exposed to B blood, you would attack it. So let's say that you are type A blood and you are type B blood, and she needs blood. And so you, being the generous person that you are, decide to give her a pint of your blood. So, but see, you have A blood, you have B blood, your own immune system with your B antibodies are going to attack the B blood as soon as it gets in there, and it will likely kill you.
Murder. Yeah. Murder. There you go.
Yeah.
So I'm confused on this though. So I don't fully understand. So it's like AAG. What does that stand for?
Okay.
BAB.
Okay. AG stands for antigen,
Okay.
and AB stands for antibody.
Okay. So you're saying that type A
Mm-hmm.
antigens is B antibodies.
No, what I'm saying is that
They're antagonists. Or
let
I don't
me
understand.
let me bring up my little magic screen here. Okay, here is a red cell with the A antigen on its surface. Okay.
Okay.
Now that identifies it as
A.
A.
Okay.
In the plasma are the B antibodies. Antibodies. Okay, that's what these are, antibodies. And these are the antigens here. The antigens are only the identifiers.
Okay.
The antigens are the identifiers. The antibodies are the proteins that will fight foreign substances, foreign bacteria, foreign viruses, foreign cells.
Okay.
So you have B antibodies in your plasma floating around, in plasma, floating around, and it bounces up against your blood cells. There's nothing on your cell, on the surface of your white cells and your red cells that's going to trigger those antibodies.
Because it doesn't have that B.
It doesn't have the B antigen. The only thing the B antibodies will look for are the B antigens.
Okay.
So now let's, if by chance, however, let's change this from A. We change this to B, and now we have B antibodies. The antibodies hate the antigens.
I have really bad news for you.
Why is it doing that?
It's on vanishing 10.
Ah.
I'm really bad.
Wait, go back. That one right there? Yep. Nope, go back up. Go back over. Over one more? Nope, right. Draw. There you go. Yeah.
Okay.
Boom. Whoa. No. Go to the vanishing 10.
Let's just clear the whole thing and start over.
Okay.
Okay, now let's try. Let's clear everything.
Yeah. Let's try it. Yeah.
Now let's see what happens now. I learned something new every day about this computer. Okay, so here's my red cell, but now it has a B antigen on it. And over here is floating around in solution is the B antibody,
So now it's going to attack that cell.
and it's going to go over here and attack that cell and kill it.
So somebody that is like, for example, an A blood type, will all of them have the B antibodies?
Exactly.
So,
Everybody,
like, each different type of blood will have its own specific like antibody.
right. If you have A blood, you're going to have antibodies for B.
Okay.
If you
And
have
only B?
and
There's
only
no
B
other
and
ones?
only B, that's you don't have. That's the nice thing is there aren't many choices here.
Okay.
So if you have A blood, you're going to have B antibodies. You could never take B blood from anybody.
Okay.
If you're type B blood, then you have the B antigen, but you're going to carry A antibodies.
Okay.
So-
I understand now.
Oh, I'll get to that in a second.
Okay, I understand now.
So tired.
Yeah. If you are AB, you have no antibodies.
So both.
You have
receptors.
both antigens. A
Yeah,
person with
so-
AB blood, go ahead.
No, I'm processing in my brain.
So if you have both antigens, if you are AB, that means you have the A antigens and B antigens.
So you can't have an
I mean, you
antibody.
don't need the antibody.
You don't have the antibodies because you would attack yourself. So you don't have any antibodies.
Does that affect
So is that what
somebody? Like,
happens with autoimmune diseases?
Yeah, with autoimmune diseases, you attack yourself. You know, whether it's like lupus or myasthenia gravis or
But is that like in the blood every time with every autoimmune disease?
no, autoimmune diseases are all over the place. They can attack anything.
Okay.
You know, measles. Measles has been known to destroy the beta cells in the pancreas and cause juvenile diabetes simply because the measles the virus triggers the immune system to fight the virus, but it also goes out and attacks the beta cells. Now, why would it do that? You know, why would an autoimmune response attack our pancreas and nowhere else? So,
it's a little odd.
you know, autoimmune disorders are very strange.
I have
So, oh, what?
Crohn's disease.
Oh, okay, yeah,
So
I'm sure it is. So,
That makes more sense now. So like, that's why like, O type blood is, I'm looking ahead obviously, but like, it has no antigens, so that's why they can donate
exactly,
universally,
right.
but they can only receive.
Right, they can only receive O, but AB is the universal recipient. If you have AB blood, you can take blood from anybody because you have no antibodies to attack anybody else's blood.
Okay.
So AB is the universal recipient and O is the universal donor. O has no antigens,
So
It
it's
ha-
not gonna trigger any of those antibodies.
not going to trigger any of the antibodies.
Just like the
And the antibodies here, well, let's put it this way. If I give you a pint of blood
Okay.
and you've got 6 pints of blood in your system, I give you 1 pint of blood and you know, you have, you know, half the antibodies are A and half are B. Well, if you're type B blood, then only the A antibodies are going to attack you. If you're type B, you know,
Yeah,
giving you a unit of blood the antibodies that are present in the donated unit aren't going to have any effect on you. If we give you a unit of blood that's going to trigger your own antibodies to attack it, then it becomes very serious. O can give to anybody because it has no antigens to trigger any kind of reaction. And the small amount of antibodies it might have in its plasma aren't going to affect you. AB can take from anybody. It has no antibodies whatsoever. Everybody sees it as, oh, you're me. You're a part of us because you have A antibodies or A antigens or B antigens. So you generally don't have an issue. The ideal blood donor would be O negative because that deals with the RH factor. I'm gonna get to that here in just a second.
So if you're type O, you give blood to anybody?
Yes, you can give to anybody.
But you can only receive.
You can only receive your own.
type O. Is
Right.
it the same with other three? Like
You
the
can-
AB and the A?
Right. You can take type O donor can give blood to anybody, but they can only take type O.
Can,
You can take your own type of blood, or you can take type O, because type O doesn't have any antigens for your antibodies to pick up. So you can take O regardless. And you can also take, if you're an A.
Right.
you can
Like
take an A.
I'm type A, so I can take A blood and I can take O blood.
Okay,
You know.
both of those are not going to the
Right.
antibodies.
And I can I can only give to A, but I can take from A
you
and
can
O.
give and take from A. So you personally are A, right?
Right, I'm
So
A.
you can give and take from A.
I
and you
can
also-
give and take from A. I can also take from O,
Okay,
because O is the universal donor.
what about AB?
Um,
You can
I-
take A, or
You can take from.
Oh, I
A.
can give to AB because AB can take from anybody. They're the universal recipient, as they say,
They can take from anybody, but who can they give blood to? Just AB?
just AB themselves. So
Okay.
and
Okay, I'm just confusing myself more.
AB can give to AB can take from anybody. AB can take from anybody
Because of the no antigens.
because there are no antibodies. AB can take from anybody, which means that any one of us, if we're A, B, or O, or AB, we can give to AB. It won't matter. They can take from anybody, but they can only give to themselves.
Understand.
A can give to itself. A can give to AB. A can take from O because O is the universal donor. O gives to anybody. So, okay.
Didn't mean to get you super into that. I'm sorry.
Well, that's okay.
I just wasn't,
Yeah.
I didn't understand it at first.
Well, it gets, it can get very confusing. Now, problems. There is, we call this the ABO blood system because of the A, B, and O antigens and antibodies here. Well, there is no O antigens. So, okay. Problem with RH factor. It's not really a problem for most people because most people have the RH antigen. The RH antigen, it has what's known as the D antigen. If you have the antigen on there, you're considered RH positive. And that's as far as it goes.
So is that where like the A positive comes into?
That's
play?
A positive, or like I'm A positive because I have the RH factor. I have the D antigen there, and that's all it means.
Okay.
It causes no problems for people that are RH, that have if you have the antigen, you have no issues. If you don't have the antigen, you are considered RH negative. So you would have A negative or B negative or O negative or AB negative. And again, that doesn't cause a problem either. The only time it causes a problem is if you are RH negative, because there are no antibodies. There are no antibodies for the RH factor normally. The only time it would cause a problem is if you are RH negative and you are exposed to positive blood. And so we accidentally give you your AB, we accidentally give you AB negative. I mean, AB positive and you're AB negative. That's different than just a regular old universal recipient. So we give you AB, we gave you AB positive.
Mhm.
First time you've ever been exposed to AB positive, nothing happens. You're fine. Those red cells are only going to last about a month, but what they will do is they will trigger production of antibodies. And those antibodies, by the time the antibodies get formed, the red cells are all gone, so you don't have an issue. But now you're sensitized. You're carrying, if you've been exposed to the D antigen, if you've been exposed to positive blood and you are negative, you will produce antibodies for positive blood. Now, what are the odds of you being exposed to positive blood again? Pretty slim, okay? Because it would have been a fluke occurrence for you to get the wrong blood the first time around anyway. Only problem is if you're a female and you're Rh negative and the baby, because if the father of the baby is Rh positive, the Rh positive factor is always genetically determined as a dominant trait. And so the baby will always be Rh positive. Now, again, not a problem if you've never been sensitized. Baby number one comes along. Baby number one is Rh positive, mother's Rh negative. Baby gets delivered. There is a sharing of antibodies at delivery, and the mother becomes sensitized to those Rh positive antigens. Doesn't affect the baby. There is no mixing of blood during pregnancy. It's two separate blood supplies. But now she has become sensitized to the D antigen, the Rh positive antigen, and she's producing antibodies now. So she gets pregnant again. Again, she has a positive baby with her negative blood, but now she has antibodies that can cross the placenta and attack the baby and kill it in utero very quickly. So how do you fix that? There is a drug called Rogan that is given to pregnant females that are Rh negative, and that will destroy the any antibodies that any positive antibodies that she has. It doesn't matter if she's never been sensitized for it, because you don't know that. Suppose that you were 3 years old and you were exposed to positive blood at 3 years old. And it used to be said that if you were a Rh negative female, you could only have one child, because you would, any more of that you would kill it. And some people would have had 2 children, but then after that, it was very, very risky, because she was probably sensitized to the D antigen at that point. If you are a positive female and the father is negative, it's not a problem. That's not gonna affect the child. But it is a concern on for the Rh negative pregnant female, to make sure that she doesn't have an issue with the baby. Now, blood typing, to give you an idea of how important this is, if you've ever been in the hospital and you have the IV line going into you, and they have all those little numbers on the IV line, and that they come in and check those numbers every time they do anything, they add anything to that line to make sure everything matches, because you don't want to give somebody the wrong medication or the wrong blood. But every year, about 3 people out of millions of transfusions of blood die from mismatch. Now, with all those precautions in place, you shouldn't have anybody dying. But at least the average is about 3 people a year. And it's either because mistakes had to happen. When I lived in Virginia, a good friend of mine was a lawyer. I guess he still is a lawyer. And he worked for one of the local hospitals. And they had a case where a patient died from a transfusion mismatch. And it was really complicated because there were these 2 people in one room. They had both sequestered their own blood ahead of time for the surgery. So they're doing everything right. They switched the beds. Yeah. One person was by the window, one person was by the door, and the person by the door wanted to be by the window, and the one by the window said, I'd like to be by the door. So they switched and didn't tell anybody. And that night they came in and gave a unit of blood to the patient by the window, and it was the wrong blood. It should have gone to the one by the door, and nobody caught it until they died. Apparently not. They
They just
never,
said go get bed one, basically. And
Yeah.
they switched they switched, so
Yeah.
they just said
Oh,
the
the patient.
The patient switched themselves.
Yeah, then no.
didn't tell anybody, but it still should have been caught. So even though the patients did that, it still should have been caught because they always should be checking the number on the line. You know, when you got that number on your tag, on your chart, on the written, usually written above above the bed, and on every line going into you should all be tagged there. Well, it didn't happen, and they died. You know, and it happens. It can happen pretty quickly because what happens is you get this clotting forming throughout your body, and it's probably pretty unpleasant. So
So it's basically like immediate.
within hours, yeah, you know, if you catch it early enough and start seeing a reaction, then you can treat it.
How?
Anticoagulants, a lot of to break up the clots that are forming. But again, it's the middle of the night. You know, your patient's asleep. You run the blood in there, and you know, by the time anybody catches it, it's too late. You know, so there's a whole lot of bad things had to happen together for that to go on. But again, it comes back to the patient switched to beds and didn't tell anybody.
So what kind of reaction would you see with that?
Probably a lot of swelling, difficulty in breathing, heart racing. Clots are going to form. You're going to be retaining fluid in the arms and legs, that kind of stuff. So it would be very uncomfortable very quickly. But again, it can be caught if you're paying attention to it. Middle of the night, 3 o'clock in the morning, whatever. Sort of hard to catch that. So very unfortunate that it happened. But and that's why we say that, you know, 3 cases a year when they should be 0. That's still, you know, to a lot of people, that's still a significant number, you know. Okay, let's take a look at the white cells. There are red cells, white cells, and platelets. We have about 5 million or so red cells per cubic millimeter of blood, about 5,000 white cells, and about 350,000 platelets. The order of the white cells, the most common type are the neutrophils, followed by the lymphocytes, the monocytes, the eosinophils, and the basophils. And they all have different roles to play here. And they all look different too. They're the red cells. They look like a big ball of red. They're hemoglobin. They look like a red balloon. The platelets are little tiny cell fragments. The 5 different types of white cells have different structure, different shaped nuclei. They all come from the exact same stem cells, though. So they all have the same source. And again, they all do different things for us. They stain a little differently. Some are very easy to spot, like the neutrophil, the most common white cell, has a multi-lobe nucleus. The lymphocyte has a nucleus that fills up most of the cytoplasm. The monocyte looks like a kidney bean. The eosinophil has a double-lobed nucleus, and the basophil looks like a blueberry. Or actually a blackberry. Okay, so red cells, erythrocytes. There's a whole slew of erythrocytes. 5 million erythrocytes in a cubic millimeter. And when you do a smear of blood, and that's what they call it, they put a drop of blood on a glass slide and they spread it out flat and then let it dry and put a stain on it. And then you look at it, and because otherwise they're almost transparent if you don't put some sort of stain in there. You would see in your field of view usually 1 white cell. So you see lots and lots and lots of red cells with only 1 white cell. In this case, we see the most common white cell. We see a neutrophil right in the middle. But the erythrocytes all look the same. We call them a biconcave disc. They look like this. They have a dimple on each side to increase the surface area for gas exchange. And they have nothing else. No nucleus, no organelles, no nothing. And each one of these red cells will give up about 20% of its oxygen as it makes it pass through the body, still retaining about 80% in reserve. So even if it doesn't get recharged, it still has plenty of oxygen to give out. That's our reserve. That's what we draw on, like if we decide we stop walking, we go run up a flight of stairs. The platelets, again, are nothing but fragments. And you can see we used a different type of stain here, and they all stain purple. The red cells don't show up much. In fact, if you were to look at unstained red cells on a smear, you would see they would be so faint you'd almost miss them. So, but these are the platelets here, about 350,000 of those available, and their primary role is to form a plug if we have a penetrating injury. Now, there is a mnemonic that lets you remember the order of the white cells. And it's unfair to monkeys because I'm sure monkeys like bananas, but never let monkeys eat bananas. N for neutrophils, L for lymphocytes, M for monocytes, E for eosinophils, and B for bananas. From the most common with the neutrophils to the least common of the basophils. So, and I will tell you from past experience in trying to do this in a lab, the basophil is almost impossible to find. You know, I mean, it's so few in number that if you every time you think you've got it, you realize it isn't. And if you do find it, you end up bumping the microscope and there goes 2 hours worth of searching. So Dr. Grice and I gave up looking for basophils a long time ago. So the neutrophils, they have three or more lobes in their nucleus. They are the first white cells that show up in an infection. They last for about 24 hours. So we can flood an area with them, and they're going to go out and absorb foreign substances, bacteria, cell fragments, viral particles, things like that. And we'll just flood the area. And what we see here, it's very unusual to see 4 together in a cluster in those white cells with those red cells in the background. Normally we would see just 1. So there may be something going on here that they didn't point out to us, but usually you would just expect to see 1 white cell, 1 neutrophil. There's, again, the same thing here. Now you notice that there are some rouleau formations forming in here. So it's possible, that's what these things are, the rouleau formations. There may be some infection going on, which would explain why we have 4 neutrophils where you expect to only see 1. So, but again, they're multi-lobe nucleus, very easy to spot. They're the easiest white cell to find. Lymphocytes, the nucleus, second most common type of white cell. The nucleus fills up most of the cytoplasm. Lymphocytes are either going to be T cells or B cells. The T cells are the hunter-killer cells. They mature in the thymus in our first year of life, and they retain that, what we call immunocompetency, the ability to hunt down foreign antigens throughout our lifetime. And they came from the bone marrow and mature in the thymus. The B lymphocytes also come from bone marrow, and they're the ones that produce the antibodies that will target pathogens for destruction or block the surface of their antibodies so they can't do anything. And they're called B cells or B lymphocytes because they matured in the bone marrow. There's our lymphocyte. You know, the nucleus fills up most of the cytoplasm. Third category are the monocytes. They have a nucleus that's shaped like a kidney bean or a horseshoe or both. It is, usually pretty distinctive. Sometimes you get this and the eosinophil mixed up, but they're usually pretty distinctive. This turns into a great big macrophage. So if you have dead and dying cells, if you have bacteria that you want to eat, this is what you draw out. If you have damaged cells from an injury, you're going to use these to get rid of it. It was initially thought that an overabundance of monocytes occurred during mononucleosis. And that's why mono was called mono, because of the thought it was the monocytes. It turns out that it has nothing to do with monocytes. It's still about lymphocytes. So we'll talk about that in the lecture. But anyway, those are the monocytes. They're going to go out. They're going to eat things that are shouldn't be there. Dead cells, dying cells, bacteria, viruses, stuff like that.
It's funny, I could remember that you turned it on its side because I didn't pack it.
Oh, there you go. That works. So well, and there it's on its side. So there's your monocyte right there. So now this is the eosinophil, and they're the same cell. That one has a different type of dye put on it. We find in histology there's all sorts of dyes for different tissues to make them stand out. Otherwise, they all look the same. 2 lobes instead of 3. These tend to show up during allergic reactions. You know, you're having a reaction to something, maybe a bee sting or peanut butter or whatever. They also show up during parasitic infections. If you have worms, if you have a patient with worms of some sort, maybe a tapeworm, they're likely going to have more of these eosinophils present than normal. But you should have, remember, if you look at the mnemonic, the eosinophils are the next to last category. So there shouldn't be very many eosinophils. They're very distinctive in shape, but there shouldn't be many of them present normally. So there's another eosinophil there. Okay. The last category are the basophils. The basophils look like a blackberry. Basophils release histamine and heparin. Histamine triggers the inflammatory response. Histamine causes us to have swelling and redness around an injury to increase blood flow. It also causes our noses to run and our eyes to water when we're exposed to an irritant, an allergen. The whole purpose of our runny nose and watery eyes is to try and flush away the irritant. And we take antihistamines to stop that. So basophils also release a natural anticoagulant in our bodies called heparin that allows us to increase our blood flow to a region where there's an infection going on. So they play a really good role for us. There aren't many of them. They're the bananas of the mnemonic, but they play this, you know, they're going to trigger the reaction we need to have when we have a problem. Unfortunately, they can overachieve when they secrete large amounts of histamine when we're stung by a bee. And then we get this massive response, which we don't want to have. So
That would be an allergic reaction.
that would be an allergic reaction, yes. So, okay. Now this is a pathogenic condition. This is known as acute leukemia. And there's 2 types of 2 categories, acute and chronic. Acute leukemias tend to affect children and chronic tend to affect adults. With either leukemia, you are overproducing white cells that are immature. They can't function as a white cell because they don't differentiate into the various categories. They're just lots and lots and lots of white cells. You should see 1 white cell in a field like this, not hundreds. Also, you'll notice that most of the white cells all look the same. Here's one over here. You have 3 in the corner there that look like they're undergoing mitosis and cell division with 3 cells all together. The daughter cells are there and the parent cell never left. So you don't, that's pretty unusual to see. There we go. It's pretty unusual to see something like this in here. We see a number of what look like macrophages there, and one down here, and there's another one. Where to go? Anyway, but look here. This one looks like it's having mitosis with 3 cells. Here's mitosis with 2 cells. All of these cells look. There's another macrophage, but they all look identical. They're not functional because they can't fight infections. And so your patient with acute leukemia is going to have an overabundance of white cells. Notice the fact too that the red cells are all in rouleau formations, and so the red cells can't function either. So your patient with leukemia has a hard time fighting off infections, and they also have poor circulation and poor delivery of oxygen. A patient with this condition would often be getting transfusions of whole blood or packed red cells just to improve their oxygen delivery. And the fact that their bone marrow is overproducing these red cells, these white cells, means that they are at risk for dying from a sore throat or a nasal infection, a rhinovirus, a head cold, if you will, because they can't fight it off. And so this is, cases like this, you have to destroy the white cells. You have to destroy the bone marrow so they stop producing so many white cells and stop producing so many, defective red cells. Usually you end up doing you would have to do a bone marrow transplant to treat this. Now, the good news for leukemias is that the survival rate is well above 90% now in various leukemias. 50 years ago, it was just the opposite. The survival rate was 10%, the mortality rate was 90%, but it has flipped now. But people still, it still kills people. Not many, but it still does. And it's usually, this is what you see in an acute case where you've got lots and lots of immature cells that can't function. And of course, since you're overproducing these immature white cells, you're not producing enough red cells too. So this is acute leukemia. Let's clear this, and we call it atypical leukocytes. And then this next one is sickle cell disease. Sickle cell disease is caused by a genetic mutation. It's a very simple substitution of an amino acid. Hemoglobin has a 360 amino acid chain, and the number 6 hemoglobin amino acid in hemoglobin is valine. And with sickle cell disease, we substitute glutamic acid for valine, or valine for glutamic acid, whatever. We put the wrong amino acid in the number 6 spot. Out of 360 amino acids, we get the thing wrong right at the beginning. It's genetically determined that way. A person, it's an inherited condition that you acquire from your parents. Now, by having, I think it's valine for glutamic acid in the number 6 spot, and that alters the hemoglobin. The hemoglobin assumes a twisted and bent and brittle shape, particularly when we're under stress, when we're exercising, when we're involved in physical exertion, which then causes the red cells. Since the hemoglobin is twisted and assuming the crescent shape when we're involved in a lot of strenuous activity, so are the red cells. And the red cells become brittle and stiff. Red cells need to be squishy to pass through the capillaries. So it hurts for blood cells, for sickle cell infected cells to pass through the capillaries. It hurts in the joints. It hurts in the movement here, particularly under exertion. Plus, the oxygen carrying capacity is reduced by about 80% in those cells, in the red cells that are affected the most. Now, not every red cell is doing that, but a lot of the red cells are going to become are going to assume that shape, and their carrying capacity is knocked way down. And so your individual with sickle cell disease is prone to illnesses and a shorter lifespan, and they're carrying both, they're carrying both the recessive traits for this. So you can also be a carrier. To have full-blown sickle cell disease, you have to inherit 2 recessive traits, one from your mother, one from your father. Many people are carriers where they have one of the traits. They usually exhibit no symptoms, or if they do, they may have very, very mild symptoms, but usually they have none at all. The odds of them passing that on to their offspring depends on the mathematics of the probability of chance, depending on which sperm cells or egg cells are going to be fertilized, and whether or not the mother or the father is also a carrier, because it takes 2 of these recessive traits to have the disease. Many people are carriers and never, never encounter another carrier. Yeah.
Science teachers said something about if you go, people with sickle cell disease shouldn't go on airplanes.
Yeah.
Why is that?
Because the pressure changes because you go from sea level air pressure and you go up several atmospheres, like 30,000 feet in there. And so to maintain a constant air pressure equivalent to sea level, you have to add more oxygen in there. So when you're flying in a plane, you're under, the pressure is greater inside. Remember,
Does it make the blood part of the blood?
it affects the joints. It affects the flow of blood through the vessels in the joints, because it wouldn't, if you don't have sickle cell disease, you don't feel anything other than maybe your ears pop. But if you do have it, since you have difficulty already getting that blood through your capillaries, because some of them are always going to be crescent shaped like that, then it's going to make it more difficult. There's more pressure on those cells to get through, and it's going to hurt. So, and so in fact, we brought this up yesterday too, about traveling. That many people with sickle cell disease, if they're a carrier, never have an issue with traveling. People with the disease usually do. So if you're only a carrier of it, you may have no symptoms whatsoever. Now, bizarrely, the sickle cell, if you have the trait, we call it sickle cell trait, in sub-Saharan Africa, where sickle cell disease came from, so if you have the trait but not the disease, you are immune to malaria, of all things.
That's
Yeah.
interesting.
Yeah, malaria kills 3 or 4 million people a year, mostly children. And yet, if you have the trait, you survive. And you have to often wonder if the trait did not provide immunity from malaria, would the disease have disappeared hundreds of years ago, because people would have died from malaria and take the disease with them? It would have died out of the population. Who knows? But for some reason, and this may provide a way to treat malaria, people with the trait have an immunity to malaria.
It's very interesting.
So
is the trait like your carrier?
you're a carrier. You don't exhibit.
So meaning you could give it to your children?
All you could do to your children is to give them the trait.
It's just get so.
Yeah, the only
even
way
if you-
your children would have the trait, have the disease, is if a male with the trait and a female with the trait reproduced and had a
And
child.
then the child is person.
But even then, it would be like a 25% chance for every child. So not every child, a husband and wife with each one having the trait could produce 10 kids. Not one of them would have disease. They would likely all be carrying the trait,
Okay.
or maybe all 10 of them could develop the disease.
That makes sense.
You have to have both traits. And because you figure when a male produces sperm cells, half the sperm cells are going to have the trait and half of them aren't. And if he reproduces with a female who has no trait, all of her egg cells are going to be trait free. So the odds are 25% that for every time they have a child, the odds are 25% that they would have the trait, and 75% they won't. And even if they both have the trait, the odds are 50% that you will or you won't. So it's a 50-50 per child. So it's not like 10 kids later and it's like, well, I should be okay now. No one's gotten the disease. Well, it's still 50-50 per child. So it's all the luck it's all probability in that case. So, but the odds are pretty good though for an individual. If one of the couple has the trait, the other one doesn't, the odds are pretty good that all the child can possibly have is a 25% chance of being a carrier. So they're not guaranteed to be a carrier. If the father has a trait but not the disease, then he could pass that trait on. He could even pass the trait on if he has the disease. But again, it still comes down to the worst that he could do is if he has a disease, he has both recessive traits, the worst he could do is pass on one trait to his offspring. So you still have to have a male and a female contributing a recessive trait each to have it show up. So, okay, and that's everything on blood that we want to cover. So,
So
thank you.
the quiz next week for lab, it's just over the endocrine,
Endocrine, repro, and blood,
so all three.
all three.
Okay.
It's all based on, pictures, models and pictures.
So mostly pictures or just structure in general?
It's gonna be, I can, if you come in here to take it, you'll have,
You'll be like, okay, what is this? And it'll be like the adrenal.
right, I'll have an arrow on the adrenal. What is this?
Okay.
Something like that.
Or like structures where it's like, another question, because especially with like the endocrine system, like for example, the hypothalamus triggers the
Yeah,
hypothalamus, the pituitary gland.
right.
So like that, we would need to know that information. I mean, obviously we
Stick,
need to
with-
know it.
you
but-
need to know it for lecture, but this is all anatomy.
So it's more just.
Yeah, so be able to tell me, like,
Identify things.
identify things, like the ovary, for the repro part, what are these things that look like an anemone? Does it look like an anemone?
Yeah,
Yeah.
it does.
It's an anemone. I'm gonna call it an
So it's gonna be things like
anemone.
that.
Things like that,
And then, because I wanted to clarify, because me and Jonathan were trying to study, and I was like,
Yeah,
we need to
no.
know for the lab.
Very little physiology for lab.
Okay,
It's all about the anatomy. And we've already covered the physiology in the lecture. And we're gonna get more into that when we get into repro in lecture. So, but for the lab test, next week, it's all about the anatomy.
okay.
Okay?
Thank you for clarifying. Have a great
Certainly.
day.
You too. See you next week. Does anybody have any questions on anything else? Okay, then I'm gonna get us out of here and I'll see you all next week.